about UMR, as we affectionately call ourselves. This group was formed in late 2015, so not that old, but it's called an interleague organization because it overlaps regions, and the 4 states that are involved in UMR are the Iowa, Mississippi, Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Illinois. Got a little frog in my throat here. And that link will, if you want to multitask, you can look at that. Gretchen has a great video there about our history and our formation. The emphasis, of course, is trying to educate people on the issues surrounding the Mississippi River, and particularly this part of it. Those issues cover a whole gamut of kind of concerns, from automobile exhaust to poop in my dog's poop in my yard, which I'm encouraged by my water association to clean up so it doesn't run off, and a variety. So on our website, you can see our upcoming schedule. Every 2 months, even numbered months, we host an afternoon program on the first Monday of the month. And so we're filling out this season with some pretty interesting topics. So I urge you to check into that while you have time or after this meeting. So we're glad you're all here. This is a pretty exciting combination of organizations working on particular watersheds, one a broader picture, and then another one sort of narrowing it down more locally. So we have 2 different watersheds you're going to hear about today. I'm going to turn it back over to Gretchen to introduce our first speaker from Farmers and Fishers in Wisconsin.
Yeah, so Heidi Keuler, you want to wave, Heidi? Will be our first speaker. She's the coordinator for the Farmers and Fishers Partnership for the Upper Mississippi River Basin. And that's a self-directed group of non-governmental agricultural and conservation organizations and state and federal agencies working to support locally led projects that add value to farms while enhancing aquatic habitat and native fish populations. I'm going to let people in here. So we had Heidi come and speak to our group 3 years ago. It was nice weather and we were in La Crosse back when we still actually met with people. And we learned a lot about fishers and farmers then. Heidi lives in what they call the driftless area, which I think a lot of us do. That's the area that wasn't covered by glaciers. And so it is hilly and there's lots of groundwater, surface water interaction. And it's an important and exciting part of the world. Heidi explored farms as a child. And so she kind of grew up in the creeks around the area. And she now has 3 kids and does all those things with her kids. So I'm gonna let Heidi get going here while I keep letting people in. And Heidi's gonna share her screen and talk to us. Thanks, Heidi.
I wanna jump in. What we're gonna do is we're gonna let Heidi and then Clark and Faith talk. So hold your questions, but in the meantime, feel free to put them in the chat. So if you wanna remember them, Gretchen will monitor those and we'll come to all those questions after both presentations. Welcome, Heidi.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And can all of you see my screen there yet?
No. Yes.
Oh. Let's see. Now you can?
Yes.
Okay. Am I sharing your screen, all of you guys, or am I sharing my own screen? It's hard to, I have 2 monitors set up here. It's not quite showing me which one I'm sharing yet.
We see ourselves.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry about that. We even practiced it ahead of time in here. Let me try that again one more time.
We have people still requesting the link, so we're going to have more and more people coming here.
And Heidi, we're all learning about
Okay.
Zoom. I said it's one of the positives of pandemic is that we can meet virtually, but we've all experienced the technology challenges as we wade into it. Okay, there you've got us. Perfect.
Now you can see it? Oh,
Yes,
good.
indeed. Okay.
It's kind of one of those things, oops. But now it went back to the Okay, I guess I can't, I'll have to not see you for a little while here. I'm trying to see both of you or all of you and my screen, but it's not letting me, so.
The Fishers and
Yeah,
Farmers
we
screen is back
have,
up.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. And thanks, Gretchen, and all of you for inviting me back to speak with League of Women Voters. I'm very excited to share our work with you, and I'm really hoping this will drive some conversation and maybe even open some doors that we can work together with more of you across the landscape. I am a fish habitat biologist with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, but I also coordinate Fishers and Farmers Partnership. And that's where the real work happens, I believe, on the ground, working with our non-government organizations and our farmers, putting conservation on the ground. And Fishers and Farmers is an organization that's been around for the past 10 years. So we're really excited to have our anniversary this year. And like Gretchen said, I grew up in the Driftless area. And so we took a lot of what was learned in the Driftless area and applied it to Fishers and Farmers when we were forming our organization. And a lot of you may know, or maybe you don't, Aldo Leopold worked in the Coon Creek watershed, the watershed I grew up in. And so Aldo Leopold worked with some of my neighbors' ancestors to put this amazing conservation on the ground that you see here. And this shot is right near where I grew up. So I'm really excited. All the work that he did lives on. And so Fishers and Farmers is one of 20 national fish habitat partnerships. We receive our funding from the Fish and Wildlife Service through the fisheries program, but then it does go on the ground in the Upper Mississippi River Basin that you see here. And we have 5 fish habitat partnerships in our area. I am based out of La Crosse, but I work in all 5 states. And we work on the goals and objectives that you see here on your screen. Our main goal, of course, is to protect healthy waters, improve fisheries, reconnect rivers and streams, and reduce sedimentation, phosphorus, and nitrogen runoff to stream habitats. And we really believe that that really happens by working with everybody in a community approach. We support farmer-led committees, and you'll see some of that work in a little bit here. And we promote best management practices. And we really want to get at the root of the problem. We don't want to just put a Band-Aid on the problem or the issue that we've really seen in the past. We don't do your typical fish habitat projects. We don't just do stream bank stabilization. We will do that, but we will partner it up with best management practices in the farm fields as well. On your screen, you're going to see some of the projects we work on. And like I said, these aren't your typical strictly fish habitat projects. We do prairie strips where we're planting prairies alongside row crops. We do Oxbow Restoration and stream crossings, bioreactors, a lot of different practices, brand new practices, innovative approaches that haven't always been done by your typical fish biologists. We also work on Aloha Dam removals, and this project is in Iowa. And a lot of people don't realize when dams go in, it has a huge impact on the fish and aquatics, freshwater mussels there. It slows down the water, it increases the temperature, and it completely can change the whole guild of fish species that live there. You might go from a cold water fish habitat to a cool or even a warm water fish habitat by putting in dams. So we really like to work with farmers. This was a demonstration project. We're hoping that once this goes in, we can do outreach and then show this practice to other farmers. One of our biggest projects is the Oxbow Restoration in the Boone River watershed. And we've been doing work with the Nature Conservancy for the past 10 years. Our first Oxbow was brought to us by Iowa DNR. Of course, so we're working with Iowa DNR. We're working with all of the counties that you see in the map on your screens up here. We're working with Iowa Soybean Association and businesses. And so it's a really huge collaborative working with the farmers doing these Oxbows. We started with the first Oxbow and in 2012. Since then, we've funded, Fishers and Farmers has funded about 12 of them. But since then, we have almost 40 Oxbows in that watershed. So you can see we just kind of start with one and it just grows. And so it's not just Fishers and Farmers funding them, but it's Iowa Soybean Association and it's all these great organizations putting these Oxbows in the watershed. And for those of you that might not know what an Oxbow is, basically it's a cutoff backwater habitat of a stream. The stream naturally meanders back and forth, but over time it can change its route, and that cutoff area then is called an Oxbow. What we do is we bring in an excavator and we dig those Oxbows out so that they fill with water during the flood season. And so that's great floodwater storage. It reduces nutrients, and Fishers and Farmers is really interested in the Fish and Wildlife Service because it's habitat for a federally endangered species called the Topeka shiner. And so you can see on your screen here, we have the Topeka shiner. It's a little minnow, and you can see both its breeding coloration and then non-breeding. And this is a great picture of us seining one of those Oxbows with university students there. So that's really great. We can get the university students involved in monitoring and really looking at these Oxbows long term and how much nitrate they actually reduce. We worked a lot with Chris Jones, who at the time worked with Iowa Soybean Association, and now he's with the Iowa Flood Center on monitoring some of that tile, because we do have tile outflows that go into those. And so just an awesome way to reduce nutrients on the landscape and bring a lot of great habitat for not only fish, but waterfowl, birds, and all of the critters as well. So I don't decide Fishers and Farmers projects. You can see the steering committee here. We have a great diverse steering committee made up of folks from all 5 states. We have the Department of Natural Resources and Missouri Department of Conservation on there. We also have Minnesota corn growers. I mentioned earlier, Iowa soybean, Wallace Pasture Project, the U.S. Forest Service. We also have a few federal agencies as well, Forest Service, USGS, and just a great collaborative of people from all different backgrounds and great skills that come to the table. And they really believe that they can do so much more in this partnership in Fishers and Farmers than they can in their own agency. A lot of times working in federal agencies or even state or county, a lot of times you find that there might be some bureaucracy or red tape or things that really hold you from doing what you want to accomplish on the ground. But when everyone comes together, sometimes we can work through that and get outside of those silos that we have in a lot of these agencies. And Fishers and Farmers is all about also creating or influencing social change, not just putting that conservation on the ground, but really working with groups socially. And we do that in a lot of different ways. One of the big ways that we started was working with a farmer-led group. And this farmer-led group was the very first one we worked on down in Missouri. And this is really helped teach us what really helps farmer-led groups grow and create success, not only on their farms, but in the whole watershed. So we've really learned a lot from the Burbus-Merrimack farmer-led group. And Fishers and Farmers supports farmer-led groups in all 5 states. And we do that in many different ways. Sometimes we present at their meetings, or we bring in programming for their field days. We loan out our equipment. We have a stream table and a rainfall simulator, a YSI, which is a water quality, it's water quality equipment that you can measure turbidity, nitrate, and all sorts of things, temperature. And we bring funding in for their farmer-led group, sometimes startup, if they are doing some kind of outreach that they want help with. We really help bring in match dollars. A lot of times when groups write for grants, whether they're federal or state, they need to have match dollars, and sometimes Fishers and Farmers is able to help provide that match or help bring in other match. Also, we have project funding we can help them with. You saw some of our projects that we listed earlier. Sometimes we're able to fund some of the projects, whether it's cover crops or rotational grazing, that kind of thing. And then also a lot of these farmer-led groups attend our Watershed Leaders Network, which is a peer-to-peer learning workshop. And I'll go into that a little bit later. Sometimes we help with initiatives they're working on. Like I said earlier, outreach, website. We have a website that they can get resources off of. We have webinars, a live radio show, and I'll get to that at the end of the talk. And sometimes we just provide letters of support for them. You can see a map here of all the watershed groups that Alex Prentice, our GIS team lead, here put together. And Alex works out of Missouri, and he helps us provide data to some of the groups, or sometimes he's able to provide layers and different things for different groups. But the great thing that Alex put together was this map that different organizations can go on our website, look and see if they have any other watershed groups nearby that they could reach out to. And the ones that we reach out to the most are listed there. We don't work with every single watershed group that you see on this map. We just wanted to get an idea how many groups there are out there. And so we really dug in and tried to learn about some of these groups and where they're located. And so this great map you can find it on fishersandfarmers.org. And here is Nancy North. Some of you may have met Nancy before or have worked with her. Nancy North is our communications lead, and she really helped Fishers and Farmers define who we were, what we wanted to work on. She is awesome at bringing people together and not only communicating, but driving work. And so Nancy North started Watershed Leaders Network, which is a peer-to-peer learning network for farmers to come. And they come for 2 to 3 days, depending on how much time they can afford away from the farm. And some of the Watershed Leaders Network workshops, the farmers are able to attend for free through resources Nancy brings in, or some other groups are able to help provide them. And because of the pandemic, the Watershed Leaders Network has been put on hold this past year, but we hope to provide another one, hopefully this next year. And so we're hoping that some of you guys will reach out to us to learn more about this group and what we're working on. And here is a great shot of one of the Watershed Leaders Network workshops we had. And we've had them in Minnesota. We've had a couple in Iowa, and we had one in Wisconsin. We're hoping to have the next one in Illinois. We also had one in Missouri. And so if you go to our website, you'll be able to find more about the Watershed Leaders Network and some of the groups that have been involved in that. And so the really cool thing with the Watershed Leaders Network, the groups come away from that with an action plan. A lot of times I go to meetings and sometimes I get back to my desk and I think, what did I really get out of that meeting? Or what do I do now, right? And so the really cool thing is at the workshop, the watershed groups sit down and come up with next steps or what needs they need and what they're going to commit. Sometimes just putting that down on paper is enough to keep that momentum going. And so that's one of the great things with Watershed Leaders Network. We're really excited to see that momentum keep moving on the ground. And the really neat thing is some of these watershed groups have even gone and attended other watershed field days. So we had the Galena folks, the Galena watershed group go all the way up to Mill Creek up in Wisconsin. They traveled all the way up and went to one of their field days to learn firsthand what they were doing on the ground. So really cool networking action that has come out of that. And this is Beth Baranski from League of Women Voters there on the left. A lot of you know Beth. And Beth came to one of our workshops and said, you know, this is great. I really would love to see a farmer-led group in the watershed I work in. And so she, you know, really listened intently in the workshop. And the next workshop, then she brought one of her farmers, I believe this is Roger Reddington. And then the next workshop, they had even more farmers. And since then, their action has grown like wildfire. You can see they have a name, a formal name for themselves. They did, I want to say, probably, I think it was 17 outreach events, you know, over the time of their funding period. They wrote a grant with Fishers and Farmers Partnership and received one. And they have done outreach events and a lot of really great work on the ground. This is one of the field days that I attended where they were showing the different cover crops on the farmer's field there. And that has been just really awesome to see all of Beth's work there with all of her farmers. And, you know, this kind of work is really what Fishers and Farmers is all about. We want to see, you know, farmers try new things, but we don't want to see, you know, them doing them because of regulation. If we can get them trying new things on their own terms, learning from each other, that's what we want to see. You know, I work in the federal government and know what it's like. I don't want to see, you know, real hard regulations coming on these farms. I want to see movement with these groups working together. Another farmer-led group that we work with is the Tainter Creek Watershed in Wisconsin. And this is in Southwest Wisconsin. And this is another great group that we work with. And they're doing some Prairie Strips projects where they're planting prairie between row crops. And they're doing edge of field monitoring. And of course, the very first strip project was started in Iowa State in Iowa, the Neil Smith National Wildlife Refuge. And since then, it has grown, and Fishers Farmers has funded Prairie Strips projects in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And I would love to see them in all the 5 states if we can. But this is another amazing group. Valley Stewardship Network is leading the work with Tainter Creek Farmer-led group, and they're working with Trout Unlimited, and they're working with Vernon County and Crawford County, and just doing some really cool work. This project, not only did they do prairie strips, but they did a stream bank stabilization with Trout Unlimited. And so this was a joint project with Fishers and Farmers Project and with the DARE Fish Habitat Partnership, the Driftless Area Restoration Effort. And that partnership is led by Jeff Hastings. Some of you might have heard of Jeff Hastings. He used to work for Vernon County before working with Trout Unlimited. And he is a legend as far as doing trout stream projects, not only in Wisconsin, but he reaches out and helps Minnesota quite a bit too. And here is a beautiful prairie strip that we'd love to see more of. It's amazing that these prairie strips sometimes in some areas hold 80% of the nutrients and the sedimentation from going into some of our streams. This is John Schurter here in the red jacket. And the first time we met him, he said, I want to work with you. You're the government. I don't want to work with you. And so we, okay, that's fine. Missouri Department of Conservation, it's a state organization. They said, let's, talk about your farm. Let's learn, what do you do on your farm? Eventually, with their work and learning from their farmer-led group down there in Missouri, they were able to talk to John and learn that he was very interested in rotational grazing and he wanted to protect his stream. And so we wrote a grant, Fishers and Farmers wrote a grant with John Schurter in 2014. And, real shy farmer, didn't want to say a lot, but we had a farmer-led committee, we had a field day, and he showed what he was doing on his farm with the funding that he got from Fishers and Farmers. Well, that really started to grow. The farmers were very interested. They came and they were calling up John and learning what he was doing on his farm. And eventually, John started a farmer-led committee. He came to also our Watershed Leaders Network workshop. He came to one of them, and then he came to the next one, and then he hosted the third one. So he's been to 3 of our Watershed Leaders workshops. And then in 2019, he was the award winner of the Leopold Conservation Award, which is Sand County Foundation out of Wisconsin, is an amazing award. And so it was really neat to see John just, grow. And now he even did a video for us. You can find video on Fishers and Farmers, John in his own words, why he's doing conservation on his farm. And I also got to meet through our work, John Aaron, and John attended our Watershed Leaders Network a few years ago as well. And he invited me to Mill Creek Watershed up in central Wisconsin to do a program with our stream table for the farmers. And then they also borrowed our water quality meter and went out there and did some work showing farmers, different, they could take readings in different areas in their watershed. And John said, I'm doing all these best management practices. How do I get my neighbors to do them? And John is leading by example himself. I don't know what he's doing asking me, because John is just an amazing amount of energy. And this past year, he just won the Leopold Conservation Award. And so his work there in Mill Creek is really, really great. They're also working with association, and they did this really cool event where the farmers in Mill Creek went and did a pontoon ride down with the Lake Association owners. So really cool exchange of information, networking as well. Here's our stream table that we can take and show how streams work. We can show groundwater impacts. We can show buffers, all different things with our stream table. And this is in the Canyon River watershed, which is in Minnesota. And now I know one of the things Gretchen wanted me to talk about was the our online and on-air work that we're doing, a lot of the outreach to show our work, but also just to connect farmers and watershed groups that are doing great work on the ground. We're finding when we work in these watersheds, it's not always funding, but it's having that committed watershed coordinator or that leader, having that consistent person drive this. And so Nancy North has really worked a lot with a lot of different groups, and Clark and Faith, who you're going to hear from in a little bit. She's actually reached out and worked with them. There's a story on our website, and so you can see that. But if you go to our website, you can reach out and you can register for our programs. And Nancy started Boots on the Ground, which is a webinar. I think of it as a webinar. She calls them live conversations where people are actually learning from each other. And we started these, the first one actually, Blackhawk Creek was featured in our very first one. So Clark and Faith, they were on our very first one. But then we also have Neighbor to Neighbor, which is a radio show that we turn into podcasts as well. And here's a shot of the very first Boots on the Ground that we had with Faith and Clark. And if you missed it, you can go to our website and they're all there. So you can see our podcasts and videos are all on our website. So if you're interested in maybe, we have just about all 5 states here. We don't quite have Missouri, but our next one coming up is Missouri. So you can go there and learn everything that people are doing in their watersheds to really connect. And this is just an advertisement for our next Boots on the Ground coming up. And you can go to our website and register. And our Neighbor to Neighbor also, and that is hosted by Pam Yonke, who is with the Midwest Farm Radio Network. And she does a really good job working with our watershed groups and really trying to pull out what makes some of these groups so successful. So we're really excited to learn, and we're constantly learning. It just is awesome to see the energy that comes out of this work. And so we're really hoping you are able to get in there and learn from some of these past programs, and maybe you even have a project that you have been thinking about that you'd like to reach to me about, and I would love to share it with our steering committee and see if we can work together. So I just want to thank all of you for today, and I look forward to hearing from Clark and Faith.
Thank you so much, Heidi. Before you leave, though, there was one question that you're going to need your slides for. And it had to do with, what do the numbers mean on slide number 2? Slide number 2, what do the numbers on the map mean?
Oh, that was the different, so each watershed group had a number. So, here I can share.
Excellent. Okay.
So yeah, so
Okay,
each of the watersheds.
Can I ask the question? It was about number 12. What was number 12? What watershed was that? If you have that
Look that one up.
information.
Yeah, I might have to look that one up. I can zoom in and I'll try to get that. I'll get that answer before the end of the call today. So I plan to stay on.
Put it. Yeah, you can just put it
Put
in
it
the
in
chat.
the chat.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and,
you're welcome.
We'll have plenty of time afterwards for more Q&A. Again, for people that just signed in, wonderful group turnout today. We're very excited about that. I'm Mary Ellen Miller, and I'm the Vice Chair of UMR, the Upper Mississippi River Region, ILO with the League of Women Voters. I put a couple of upcoming meetings in the chat. I just learned about these today. They came through my newsfeed. One of them is tonight with Chris Jones, which was mentioned earlier. Chris is one of our upper Midwest gurus in terms of water issues. So if you have a chance to catch that tonight, that would be an awesome tie-in to the program today. Before we move on to our next group of speakers, and just keep holding your questions or putting them in the chat, we'll have a long Q&A afterwards. So Heidi and Clark will stick around for us. But I have a general note from the UMR board, and it's a request. We had our board meeting this morning, and this is the time of the year when we are nominating new officers for the UMR board. And again, at the top of the chat, I put a link to the UMR website. Steve and Mary Ploser are going to be stepping down as chair, and as vice chair, I'm going to be stepping into that role. And our secretary and treasurer have agreed to stay on. However, that leaves a vacancy for vice chair of the UMR board. So we'd like to know and extend an invitation to anyone present today. It can be anyone in those 4 state regions. If you're interested in joining more aggressively with our work, which is mostly developing programs and sharing information with the leagues in our 4 state area. Look at the website, check us out, look at our history, but we're looking for someone to fill that vice chair slot. It's a 2-year term, but of course we would like you to stick around and move up. It's not required, but the chair is term limited. So as the incoming chair, I will be chair for 2 years and I can only renew for 2 more years. And then at the end of 4 years, I have to step back. So we'd like a vice chair that has been in that slot for a while to learn the ropes of UMR. So do consider that. We like a lot of diversity on our group and we sure want all 4 states represented. There is a place in the website where you can go and comment or send us a message. And if you do that, Gretchen will capture that message. Just let her know that you're interested in learning more about that job, or you would definitely like to be vice chair of UMR. We'd love to have you there. Okay, and I would say I'm pretty new to this group, so I kind of jumped in at the last minute because they had an opening for vice chair. And I knew nothing about the group, but they're a great, friendly group. And we'll have to say, I was able to get up to speed fairly fast. They're all very helpful in making sure I know what I'm doing, or at least make it appear that I know what I'm doing. So our next speaker is zeroing it down. Heidi gave us a great big overview of massive area of watersheds. And Clark Porter is going to tell us about what it's like to really zero down into one very specific small watershed. Clark works now as an environmental specialist for the Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. But prior to that, he farms, and his farm areas overlap actually multiple counties in a watershed. And he really was interested in how you could work collaboratively with landowners and farmers that cross boundaries like that. And so he developed real hard and got people pulled together, much like one of the stories that Heidi told us, and founded the Blackhawk Creek Water and Soil Coalition. Clark is a retired teacher and lives in, well, a former teacher, and he and his wife live in Waterloo, but they still farm. And his family farm, which he manages, is near Rhinebeck. So he's going to talk about how he formed this idea, how he voluntarily went out, no sort of government coming in and saying, as Heidi said, no, I'm not, you're from the government, I'm not going to listen to you. He sort of did it from the ground up and wants to share that message. And then later on, after Clark is done, we have a graduate student from the University of Northern Iowa, Faith Luce, who's going to talk to us about her work in this watershed as well. Very interested, as she grew up on the Mississippi River, and she's very interested in hydrology and hydrogeology, and so is delighted to have the position she has. So Clark, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I understand you've got a bunch of slides for us as well.
I do, thank you. I'm going to share screens here, and hopefully this will work. Can everybody hear me all right?
Yes.
Coming through loud and clear.
All right, good. I'm going to put it on a full.
And I just will remind people to kind of follow the chat. Other people are posting some pretty interesting stuff there.
And I'm also, if I can, I'm going to try to change my what I'm looking at here. Maybe I can't. There
We can
go.
see your
I'll just do
slide.
that. Okay, good. All right, well, just going to introduce myself a little bit briefly. Thank you for that introduction. That took care of most of what I was going to say. I just wanted to say I am an employee of the state of Iowa, Iowa Department of Agriculture and Land Stewardship. But prior to my professional work as an environmental specialist in continuing to be a watershed coordinator, I started the Blackhawk Creek Water and Soil Coalition. My motivation for doing that, I mean, I've been interested in conservation ever since I started managing my family's land. And our farm's 100% cover crops, 100% no-till. I do split applications of nitrogen to reduce the nitrate load. And I have 1,000 feet of a saturated buffer line. And Faith will explain what some of those things are towards the end of our presentation. Anyway, so I was motivated certainly by by what we're doing on our own farm, but also Blackhawk Creek this is a picture of the creek. It's a very special place for me. It's been a place of refuge and recreation and solace for years. I grew up around Blackhawk Creek, and most of our family's farmland is in the watershed of Blackhawk Creek. Also, I was motivated by the fact that I just felt kind of helpless about all that was happening to our planet, to our nation, to our state. And I thought I can either, kind of skulk around the house and mope and swear and whatever else, or I can maybe get started on something productive in my own little corner of the universe. And so with that, I started to look at what I could do for Blackhawk Creek. And it's like most of my projects, I had no idea what I was doing when I started. I had much more enthusiasm and knowledge. So that began the whole process. And I attended the Fishers and Farmers Leadership Network meeting and was very helpful. So I want to thank the folks at Fishers and Farmers for assisting us with this project. Also, before I begin, I wanted to just share a little disclaimer. I hope this isn't as long as some of those disclaimers in front of pharmaceutical ads. I do work for the state of Iowa, so I can't really endorse particular policies or platforms when I'm giving official presentations, but I certainly can share what I've learned, and I hope that can provide some raw material for all of you as you form your own opinions about what needs to be done about the pervasive water quality problems that we have in the Midwest and that affect everybody downstream and including the Gulf of Mexico. And so I think before I go on, I thought I'd start with some basics. I do hope that I'm not being too redundant for anybody, but I thought that it might be helpful to kind of start with some of these basics. First of all, what is a watershed? A watershed is an area of land draining to a single point. Technically, your kitchen sink is a watershed, but watersheds can be of increasingly larger proportion, and they sort of nest together like Ukrainian dolls. So if you see this picture on the left, this is the Cedar River watershed, and then the greenish area is the Middle Cedar watershed, and within that is a little kind of a yellow tan color, and that is the Blackhawk Creek watershed. And then there's an even smaller watershed in there called the Blackhawk Creek Hudson watershed. So that's kind of an example. That smaller piece is about 21,000 acres. And whereas the Middle Cedar watershed is 1.5 million acres, and the Grundy County watershed, where it says Grundy, but that's the Blackhawk Creek watershed, that's 217,000. Also then, of course, on a national scale, we've got the Mississippi River Basin covering most or all of 31 states and leading to the Gulf of Mexico. Now, a watershed reflects the uses and abuses of the surrounding land. It's when we talk about water, we talk about water health and we think, okay, we must be working on the water a lot, but in fact, we work on the land a lot. We have to manage the land in order to manage the water. And watersheds, our streams are really a lot like our bloodstream in that they reflect the health of what surrounds them. So just like a doctor might examine your blood to determine the health of your body, we can also look at our streams and our streams' health, because they are going to reflect the health of the bodies of land around them. Now, before I explain a little bit more about this slide, I want to say that we're looking particularly, Faith and I work in the area, and in water quality, we work in the area of nutrient pollution. And nutrient pollution refers to both phosphorus and nitrates, which are naturally occurring nutrients. That they're nutrients because they help plant growth. They are necessary, but they become a pollutant in excessive amounts. And so while they are naturally occurring, they are artificially introduced through human activity. And they lead to many types of problems, which I'll explain in a little while, but toxic algae blooms, poisoning of drinking water, and are also symptoms of additional problems on the land. For instance, phosphorus pollution. Phosphorus bonds with soil particles. So if you find a lot of phosphorus in the water, you probably have a lot of erosion, a lot of silt washing into the water. Now, nutrient pollution has two source categories, and one of them are point source, like cities' sewage treatment plants. Anytime you can kind of see a big pipe pumping into the river, that is a point source. You can point to it as a point source of the nutrient pollution. Whereas there are also non-point sources. And those of us in the watershed work with primarily with a non-point source of nutrient pollution. And the two, and so of the two, the non-point is the most crucial for us. In Iowa in particular, 90% of our state's nitrates enter into our streams through non-point sources. And nutrient pollution is technically an externality. And to define an externality is what economists call an externality. It's a side effect or the consequence of a certain industrial or commercial activity that affects other people, but it's not reflected in the price of that product or activity. And so, for instance, in the case of nitrate pollution, it's a side effect of our kind of highly concentrated agriculture, and yet it's not really reflected in the price of the goods. And somebody pays, actually everybody pays for nitrate pollution, but not in any, it isn't actually covered by or reflected by any of the costs of the product. And so there has to be some sort of external funding in order to clean it up. Now there are the influences of nutrient pollution and of nitrate pollution are agricultural production methods, geography and hydrology, weather and soil types, and geologic history. It's a confluence of all of those things that create the problem that we're facing. And I think another thing that helps kind of explain why we have this particular issue and why now, why are we noticing it? It's been going on for a long time, but for thousands and thousands of years, the landscape of the upper Midwest, the landscape of the upper Mississippi River Basin, where Fishers and Farmers locates a lot of its activities, looked like this. You've got wide expanses of prairie, perennial grass cover, living roots in the ground most of the year, very little exposed soil, exposed to wind or rain and water erosion. You have wetlands. Iowa, for instance, has lost between 95 and 98% of all of its original wetlands. We're in the process now of trying to put them back. That's a lot of the projects I work on. You also have oak savannas and riparian forest cover along stream banks. This was the landscape, this was the biome, this is what the soil and our own particular biome has kind of evolved in a way to do. This is how it has all worked. And into this system, into this biome, we introduce what I will call the big three. Intensive row crop monoculture. By monoculture, I mean we tend to just grow the same crops like soybeans, corn, wheat, maybe Also, a lot of runoff and drainage due to tillage of the soil and due to putting drainage tile in the ground, which I will explain in a little bit what that is, because we drain a lot of fields. And then also concentrated livestock production, confinement facilities, cattle yards, et cetera, very intensive livestock production, which produces a lot of manure. And then there is the need for how to intelligently dispose of that manure so that it doesn't also wash into the streams. And that is another challenge. All of this produces nitrates and phosphorus. They result from the high volume production, tillage, fertilizers, the nitrogen inputs, manure, soil erosion. I mean, we are pumping out a very high level of production from our soils and from our land, from these former prairies. And we've altered their functioning in a lot of ways. And so as a result, our watersheds show it. In the case, I said, of phosphorus, it bonds to soil particles. Most of it, sometimes it dissolves and can go through tile lines without bonding, but we put phosphorus on our fields. We also take away a lot of plants that would be using the phosphorus during other times, during non-cash crop growing times. Those are gone, whereas in the old prairie biome, they were there. We also have these field drainage systems. And the field drainage systems are buried, perforated plastic pipe. It used to be clay pipe that is trenched through farms and that's been able to make a lot of our land in the Midwest productive. So we've drained the soil. We've kind of plumbed our farms to drain much quicker than Mother Nature ever would have drained them. They go into streams, many of which have been straightened, and so that water is straight piped to other larger streams. We have more flashing, flooding, riverbank erosion, and eventually a lot of the flooding problems that we see on downstream, like what Cedar Rapids experienced in 2008. And in addition to that, then a lot of that water reaches the streams before it's had a chance to percolate through the ground and have the plant roots and bacteria take the nitrates out of it. Because nitrates will use, bacteria will use nitrates when they can't use oxygen. A few pictures to kind of illustrate what we're doing here. There's a tile that's being put into the ground. The tile pipes are going in. And this is a very common practice throughout much of the Midwest. We have tile on our farm. And when I was in college, a friend of mine and I had a little tiling business in a way. We did it on our farms, and we also did it on we also put tile in on other fields. There are probably, they estimate about 3 million miles of tile in the state of Iowa. They know for a fact that we drain about 9 million acres into tile lines in our state. One of the outgrowths of phosphorus pollution is algae blooms, also nitrates. The picture in the middle is of Lake Erie. Lake Erie has a significant problem with heavy phosphorus loads, and they're doing a lot of work upstream, well, in all the tributaries of the lake, in order to help develop more best practices to clean up the water, clean up the streams. Also, then we're looking at, on the top right there, you see the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And very briefly, what the dead zone is an area of low oxygen. It's produced by all these fertilizers, all this nitrogen and phosphorus and other nutrients that come down the Mississippi River, enter the Gulf of Mexico, and create an algae bloom. Then the algae die, they sink to the bottom, and the bacteria that are consuming them take all the oxygen out of the water. Also, you've got the fresh water floating above the salt water, and that provides kind of a seal so that the lower columns of water can't have access to oxygen. In the end, you get a dead zone. It was predicted to be 6,700 miles this year because both nitrate and phosphorus pollution are up this year in 2020. But Hurricane Hannah came through and mixed the water and helped save us some this year from a larger dead zone. It has been as large as the state of Connecticut, and the average size of the Louisiana or the Gulf Dead Zone is about 5,408 square miles. It costs the Louisiana fisheries $2.9 billion a year in lost revenue due to smaller or disappearing shrimp and oysters and other fisheries. Also, there's the price we pay with water and drinking water. Nitrates in drinking water above 10 parts per million are harmful to babies. There are also some linkages, continuing research about potential linkages and correlations with cancer. Various communities, some are protected by the aquifers they get their water from, others are not. When I was young, many farms had their own wells, and now we have rural community water because the wells are too shallow and often too high in nitrate concentrations. You see the flooding and other effects of phosphorus and nitrate pollution in the other pictures there. So, you know, what do we do to fix this? How do we go about it? I mean, we've talked about with fishers and farmers, you've already heard about some of their efforts, and their efforts are very similar to the ones that Faith and I are engaged in. They're assisting us. Many of us folks involved in the watershed communities throughout the nation are attempting to do many of the same things. And primarily it's that we need to manage the use of our land to remedy the abuse of our water. This, while it is an environmental concern, it is also really a social change effort. It's a social and economic effort. It involves people and the decisions they make. And these are often commercial decisions. You know, they affect their bottom line, they affect the profits, they affect the businesses that they engage in. I'm talking mainly about farming and ranching and livestock production. But certainly there's stormwater runoff and urban pollution and suburban pollution as well. This all involves, however, decisions that we make. And so this kind of harkens back to the title of my presentation. There are two landscapes we have to deal with. One is the watershed landscape, the physical landscape, but the other one, equally important, perhaps even more important, is the social and economic landscape. And we have to address that social and economic landscape if we're going to have any effect on the physical landscape. And here's where some challenges come into play. I had an experienced crop scout tell me one time that when I was looking at my fields and trying to determine what was wrong, if there were like sick looking corn plants or I was looking at low productivity in some area, if it seemed to occur within straight lines, it was probably human made. It was probably our mistake. On the other hand, if the problem appeared to have curvy lines around it or circular or irregular, then it was probably Mother Nature. Nature abhors straight lines, and so watersheds are kind of what shall we say, designed. They occur in a much different shape than a lot of our human jurisdictions. Here's a watershed, a sub-watershed of my project area. I work in the Miller Creek and Rock Creek watershed areas now. The 61,000 acre total watershed. This one's about 21,000 acres, this particular one here, Rock Creek. And you can see all the straight lines. Those are section lines for farms. And then there's fence lines, and there's a little municipality in there, and there's highways, and there's two counties. And all of them are contained within straight lines, and yet flowing in through underneath them is this watershed. And so because watersheds flow under and through multiple jurisdictions, you have to take into account the realities of that landscape of multiple jurisdictions. And this is then a geographic feature of the watershed, but it has this political shape to it as well. You have to bring in multiple stakeholders, and all of them are going to have different incentives and different expertise, different interests, but they have to all get along. They have to all work together in order for us to be successful. In rural areas, that's mainly farmers and agribusinesses and land managers and landowners. in Iowa, 52% of the land is rented. It is, in other words, 52% of our land in Iowa, over 30, excuse me, yeah, well over 30 million acres, is farmed by somebody who doesn't own it. 20% of that land is in trusts right now, and that is, if it occurs or if it goes along at the same rate, that will double. We could have 40% of the land in trusts in the next generation. So it won't just be farmers that are going to be making these decisions. So we have to find common goals among all these groups. These common goals are crucial if our watershed efforts are to be successful. So with all that said, and with all that large scale, with all of those large scale variables, what we're really looking at is local social change. We have to start with grassroots and wet boots. And I'd like to point out to you, and if some of these pictures here, if you look at the one on the top or on the left, this is a piece of poster paper from a watershed planning presentation that we had in Hudson, Iowa. And you can see where the arrow points down to the word community. And that's the ticket right there. We have to be able to create a sense of community around a watershed. In spite of all those other straight lines and all those other jurisdictions, people need to kind of come together with a sense of community. And this involves a lot of public outreach, a lot of public education, and a lot of getting people on board, helping them to understand that decisions they make affect others, and helping others to understand that there might be good intentions on the part of those people upstream, but until they may have funding or additional knowledge, until we scale up in terms of the infrastructure that's needed in order to get this done, progress could be slow. It's ripe for conflict. And so what we need to do is try to avoid that. When I began with Blackhawk Creek watershed, there were urban and suburban people who paddle and recreate in the lower stretches of the creek. And there's all these farms in the upper stretches. This could quickly have become an urban versus rural issue with people pointing fingers at each other, and I didn't want that to happen. And so I began upstream working with my fellow farmers and landowners, hoping that in the future we can come downstream and say, look what's happening here. Please join us. Let's work together on this stream. Now, like I said, I began with more enthusiasm than knowledge, and I still feel incredibly ignorant about exactly how to go about with all of this. I think we're all learning as we go. This is while it's not necessarily a new problem, it is new in terms of how we're addressing it. And here's a few of the things that I've learned in working with groups of people at the local level. One is that talking is never a waste of time. That when I began, I talked to anybody that would listen to me. And my wife tells me perhaps even too much to some people. I'd get that look sometimes from across the living room if we were wherever we were, if we were having a little gathering with people like, okay, Clark, that's enough watershed talk. And also that progress is going to involve collaboration and not confrontation. The minute that people start pointing fingers of blame, any project will fail. That we have to appeal to people's more generous, kind nature and develop collaboration and the method for it. Also, planning meetings that encourage listening, structuring those meetings with an agenda, but leaving open time for lots of listening and information gathering, that was very important. You also, at some point or other, need to develop an organizational structure, but not too soon. Because if you do that, it looks like you're already dictating what ought to happen, but certainly not too late, because then people are going to lose hope. It has to be somewhere in that sweet spot. And that sweet spot is a time when you are sort of, as I skip bottom, inviting people in on the challenges and solutions. This isn't my problem. This is our problem. This isn't your problem. People pointing fingers of blame. It is all of ours to solve. And I found that it's okay not to have an answer. As a matter of fact, it's better to have good questions and motivated people who are willing to find answers. Lastly, maybe I'll say many people are going to help you when you begin these organizations, when you begin these efforts. They'll help you because of you first and because of the watershed second. It really starts with you. You're the representative of the watershed. And then that's the avenue by which they become engaged with the whole issue. If they are, like many, and are not aware of some of these problems. And so I'll finish here just by saying that it's amazing what you can accomplish. This is a quote by Harry S. Truman. It's amazing what you can accomplish if you do not care who gets the credit. I think that's very important. If this can become a highly political process, but I think one thing that could kill it very quickly is somebody using a watershed, watershed success, or using that as their credit, as something they did. It is not something that one person can ever do. This is a collective issue. And so I find Harry Truman's quote very inspiring. My grandfather used to share that quote with me often, as a matter of fact, and he started a couple of community organizations that are still here today, and but he never took credit for it because they were, in fact, community organizations and are run by the community. So with that, I think I'll close out of my screen here and hand things over to Faith. As I said, this began with grassroots. And our organization, we began in 2017, early part of 2017, and we were able to, through good fortune and through getting the attention of others, we were able to get a grant written by Mary Beth Stevenson, who was a woman that was a watershed basin coordinator for the Middle Cedar. She and others had noticed Blackhawk Creek and wanted to help us out, and so the project was able to get funding to get somebody with boots on the ground, and get somebody to work full time in the watershed, advocating for it and working with farmers. And so we were very fortunate to do that. I think that's maybe that was one of our primary goals at the very beginning, was to get somebody in there full time. But in order to do that, we had to get people involved and we had to get everybody's attention. So what began as grassroots ended up with wet boots, and Faith is the person with wet boots, and she's working there now. So I'm gonna close out and let her begin here.
All righty, let's see. All right, let me know. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. All right, well, I first want to thank everybody for having Clark and I come on today and talk about one of our favorite things, Blackhawk Creek Watershed. I'm just going to start a little bit about myself. I graduated this spring from the University of Northern Iowa with degrees in geology, earth science, and environmental science. So I'm very into science. Well, at UNI, I got involved with doing research, including a hydrologic, hydrogeologic, and geologic assessment of Dry Run Creek watershed, which is one of the main watersheds where my university was. This spurred on a desire to become a watershed project coordinator myself. I grew up along the Mississippi River on the border of Iowa and Illinois, where I spent my time hunting, fishing, kayaking, and camping, and falling in love with everything the Mississippi River has to offer, as well as helping my family on their dairy farms. I got interested in water quality once I learned about how the Midwest agricultural practices affected the influence on the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico and how it degraded our waterways. I started as project coordinator for Blackhawk Creek this past August, and I have enjoyed every single day on the job. Our main focus as a watershed is producer relations. Establishing working relationships and familiarity with as many producers within the watershed is crucial to the success of the project, as producers are the ones who will be adopting the conservation practices that our project funds. One thing that we have done to establish producer relationships is to identify those who live within the 100-year floodplain. So that's basically anybody that their land has a 0.1% chance of flooding every single year, which doesn't seem like that much, but a lot of these producers have floods 3 out of 5 years. And so they are more likely to turn that land into CRP, which would mostly be a wetland or a prairie, than leaving it being farmed. So being able to know who has land with a high probability of flooding is important, because they're going to be more willing to make changes. We have also found that most producers will be more apt to trust the adaptation of a new practice if they have proof that it is effective and it isn't going to be a detriment to their operation. So we have been able to identify those producers who act as leaders within each priority watershed, which I didn't mention, but we have 10 sub-watersheds within Blackhawk Creek. 3 of those are priorities. So we have Hudson, Holland Creek, and Village of Rhinebeck. So we have a list of all of the top producers that kind of act as a link to new contacts, which is really nice to have them, because we can't always have boots on the ground all the time. Field work is also a really big part of what we do. It's crucial to the project, as we need to go out independently and survey sites for current or future conservation practices. So we do a lot of that in the spring, summer, and fall. Can't really do that much now. This may just be the scientist in me coming out, but data is vitally important in recording the health of the watershed and shows whether or not the project is a success. So having a routine water sampling plan established is key to the success of the project, which we currently just established with the University of Northern Iowa, our water sampling plan, and will be kicking off this April, which is very exciting. One of our biggest successes this past year is our expanse of cover crops, which cover crop is anything that's planted to maintain plant cover in a field year round. So let's see. We've had this year for 2020, we had just a little bit over 21,000 acres of cover crops, which is quite a bit. That's about 10% of our watershed, which is an increase from about 5% the year before. This is where everything gets pretty complicated. There are a lot of organizations and businesses involved in the funding and operation of a watershed project. I'm just going to touch on a few because it gets very overwhelming. So to start off with, the soil and water conservation districts of counties that Blackhawk Creek watershed spans into are involved heavily, and not really funding per se, but more of organizing and just keeping me in contact with those that I need to be in contact with. And I give updates every single month at their monthly meetings. The Iowa Department of Agricultural Land Stewardships, which is very huge and vital to the project. They are the main source of funding for the project, and who I am employed by, as well as Grundy County Soil and Water Conservation District, which also is very confusing because I'm hired by 2 entities. Let's see. The Natural Resource Conservation Service allows for the usage of office space, vehicles, and supplies, as well as providing a lot of critical guidance and training that is crucial to the success of the project, and the meeting of the Iowa Nutrient Reduction Strategy, which I'm not sure how many of you guys are familiar with that. It basically is a goal that was set by the Iowa state government to reduce nitrogen and phosphorus inputs by 41%. We don't really have a deadline for that. We're just supposed to do it, which is kind of nice. And then the UNI Earth Science Department is involved by allowing the usage of their hydrology lab, as I mentioned earlier, for the processing of our samples. I am very partial to that department because that's where I was learning and who I am. The watershed also allows for students in the earth science department to conduct their own independent research, which is really nice because to graduate in all of their degrees, you have to do independent research. So this allows for a lot of data in the watershed, which is really nice because we would have had a hard time doing that all by ourselves. The Blackhawk Creek Soil and Water Conservation Soil and Water Coalition serves as an advisory board whenever I need guidance or help getting in contact with producers or government employees. They're usually able to find those that I need to be in contact with and set up the initial meeting with them, which is extremely helpful for a new project coordinator as myself. And it really promotes and establishes lasting working relationships because that coalition has now evolved into that advisory board. And so I'm able to I have a list of contacts for each priority watershed, which is really nice because I'm just not aimlessly looking for contacts myself. Again, this is kind of confusing and very intricate. So this June, we received a 3-year grant, and the grant cycle runs from June 30th to June 30th, 2023. The grant is between the Iowa Department of Agricultural Land Stewardships and Grundy Soil and Water Conservation Districts, as well as a ton of other grant partners like the Iowa Soybean Association, Iowa Corn, Iowa Ag Water Alliance, and many, many other entities. These funds provide for a salary for a full-time project coordinator, myself, water sampling, outreach, education, and the implementation of many conservation practices. Regional IDLE staff, Grundy Soil and Water Conservation members, Blackhawk Creek Coalition members, and staff of Grundy NRCS act as point people that are able to provide guidance to me. The project coordinator myself is the boots on the ground, like Clark mentioned. I bridge the gap between the government, state entities, and producers. I organize outreach and producer visits, as well as I analyze those water samples. I do field work, and I lay the fundamental framework to ensure that the Iowa nutrient reduction strategy goals are met and that the project is successful. So there is a lot that goes under that blanket statement. I want to expand the project and set that framework, like I said, to have that long-lasting project. So to do so, I want to change our initial outlook on the Hudson Priority Watershed. So we have been brainstorming urban expansion. So I've been just recently meeting with city officials, like I have an upcoming meeting tomorrow with the Hudson's mayor and stormwater managers and stuff like that to talk about the possibility of expanding to an urban project, which is very different than what's going on now with an urban project. So now my goal is to have as many cover crops and bioreactors and wetlands and reducing nitrogen and phosphorus from entering waterways. When we do an urban project, it will be more of intercepting that stormwater drainage and to implement rain gardens and bioretention cells above storm drains. So it's going to be very, very different, but I think to have the success of this project, that's what needs to happen. So we are very excited about that. We are going to propose it at our annual review, which happens every single year at the day that our grant was signed. And then at the end of our 3 years, it's going to be written into the grant as a resubmittal, as a change to get funding for that permanently. It is apparent that there's a lot of work to be done within the watershed, and to ensure that it gets done, we are looking to hire an intern for the upcoming summer, because right now my watershed is about 217,000 acres, which is extremely large. And so just to have another set of boots on the ground is going to be very beneficial. So I'm very excited to see what advancements that brings on with the project. Some goals that I have outlined myself for the watershed is within our first grant cycle. So the first 3 years is building those community relationships with a heavy emphasis on our producers. This means contacting producers and beginning that conversation about the project, as well as building those connections with city officials, businesses, and schools. So typically I try to reach at least 1 to 2 producers every single day that I haven't ever talked to before. So I just call them up and I'm like, hey, I've noticed you do this. Can we have a time to talk about your operation? And usually we just go get a cup of coffee or go out to their farm and they show me what they're doing, and that opens up the door to have that conservation conversation, I like to call it. So that is really nice to have. For our 5-year goal for the watershed, we want to see a reduction of nitrogen of 5 to 10% over the priority watersheds, which is that's a very mild estimate. I would like to see a lot more than that, but just to be modest at first. Our grant emphasis is to construct as many edge of field practices as possible. I don't know how many of you guys know what those are, so we actively seek landowners who want to adopt things like wetlands, oxbows, which we learned about earlier from Heidi, prairie strips, and saturated buffers, which are there's a lot of people that are willing to adopt those practices, and we have a lot of funding for that. But a lot of times the land doesn't really work with us, and there is going to be a lot more detriment for putting those in than benefits. So those have been pretty hard to find, but we are still very motivated in finding those. Cover crops are a great way to improve soil health structure and increase organic matter. And it's very easy to have a beginning producer that wants to get into conservation and are very hesitant just because they don't really want to risk that much or lose a lot of profit. And so we usually recommend cover crops. And my goal is to have about 54,000 or more acres of cover crops by the last year of this first grant cycle. And that, I know that was a lot shoved into one. So if you have any questions, please let me know and I will answer them as best as I can. But that is the end of my presentation.
Great, thank you so much, Faith. Remember, you can throw your questions into the chat. Gretchen wanted to know, she had heard someplace that for cover crops to really, I guess, okay, to be effective, you have to get up to 40% of the watershed. So you mentioned your goal is 25% in what kind of time frame?
Yep, so that is going to be 3 years. And
Okay.
so I would like to, again, double that within the 3 years of the grant resubmittal. So just keep going off of that. And especially in this area, because we have a lot of wind-blown sediment and soil erosion is going to be a big issue. So to have those cover crops and those roots kind of keeping all of that soil like cohesion together and all of that, it really helps quite a bit. And it's really good for introducing soil organic matter. It's not that ideal for reducing nutrients. So for those, that's what we like those edge of field practices for, but it is really good for soil organic matter and just improving that soil health, which is really what we see a big problem with producers. Just because you are just tilling up that soil, you're having that monoculture, so it really degrades it. So it's really nice to see cover crops in the field.
I will give full disclosure here with some of my questions. I am a Soil and Water District Commissioner in Wayne County, Iowa. Totally different topography that presents some real problems to cover crops. But I have an idea that one of our problems may be universal, and that is with climate change. Some of our landowners and our producers, and for the urban people, I also want to mention these words, okay? NRCS tends to use the name producer instead of farmer because it tends to incorporate both the landowner and the farmer. But obviously you've got to connect with those landowners. So I want to come back to that question. But the other one about cover crops is we are finding that these late fall rains have really interfered with getting the seed in the ground. And we've tried aerial seeding and then the rains just wash it off because it's not drilled. So I'm not saying that there's a solution to that, but I want other people to understand that just cover crops by themselves sounds wonderful, but it in practice can have its own challenges. And also for our area, we actually rent seeders because people don't want to invest in that equipment. To get those cover crops in to help encourage them. But I wanted to go back to the piece about connecting with your producers, because a lot of, I think over half of the land, the farmland in Iowa, arable land, is farmed not by the landowner.
Yes, that is true.
And the other thing that we're facing in Iowa is this high turnover of land ownership due to demographics. The great generation is dying off. And so how do you find those, how do you work with where you've got an absentee landowner? How do you manage to reach out and find all those people? Because we find that very challenging.
Yep, so we have a couple ways around that. So for our watershed, we do biannually newsletters, and we have the mailing information of all landowners and operators within the watershed. And so we're able to send that all out. And that list was generated by my predecessor, Laura, and she went through GIS and did a whole bunch of computer stuff and worked with FSA and got all of that information together for me. And so we have a pretty solid mailing list. It took her a while. It took her maybe a couple weeks to get all of that done, but that's pretty helpful. We do work with absentee landowners by, if we're doing an edge of field practice, like we're doing a saturated buffer right now with a owner who lives in Missouri, but he has an operator that lives at the farmhouse. And so we just called him up and we were like, this is kind of what we wanted to propose. Are you interested in this? Do you want to be a part of this? You don't really, anything has to come out of your pocket. This is what the operator wants to do. And we have funding for this. And typically they're very involved with that and they don't have a problem with that. So I haven't really ran into that many issues with an absentee landowner. But there will be times that I will. But those are pretty much our ways around that, is just giving them a phone call, telling them what we're doing, what our plans are, and getting them involved with the operator as well.
A question from Maggie Sullivan about those edge of field, and then you can jump in too, Clark. What edge of field practices are easiest to adapt, and any strategies that work well to get producers on board? So to kind of go back to what Faith was talking about.
I might need Clark's help on this because that's a hard question.
Okay.
All right. Yeah, I was going to say very quickly, two other ways that I'm currently exploring right now for reaching the owners, but not the farmers, is I did have a meeting with trust officers a while ago and presented the issue to them and talked about, rental agreements, factoring in conservation measures. Because I think if we can get trust officers on board, and they can talk to their trustee, the people for whom they're serving as trustees about how this affects the long-term, health and productivity of the land. Plus, it's the right thing to do. That perhaps we can find some leverage there. Secondly, I'm interested in something that's going on with soil and water conservation districts up in Minnesota. And I would be remiss if I didn't say, by the way, that my soil and water conservation district are just integral to everything we do. Yes. While there are the straight borders there, sometimes districts are used to working with each other. And we have like a state association, and it's pretty active with all of, with collaborating among. And we've had no problem with collaborating between our counties over projects and watersheds that share borders. So they are an integral political unit. You can't get anywhere without them. In Minnesota, they have a certification process for landowners and for the land. And they have to pass this. There's an assessment of of soil health and water quality management. And then a lot of times landowners are reaching out and saying, hey, I want to rent my land to a farmer that's certified. And the farmers that are certified are using that as kind of like a bullet on their resume, and when they're looking for land to farm. And so I find that really interesting, and possibly another avenue towards that. As far as the edge of field, I think, Faith, maybe you'd agree with me that probably the easiest edge of field intervention would be something called a saturated buffer, which is where you reroute the drainage tile to a distribution line of perforated tile that runs perpendicular to the stream. And rather than having the tile water dump out into the stream, it bleeds out of the drainage line, filters through the soil profile and leaks into the stream. And while it's filtering through the soil profile, the bacteria that are in the soil and the plant roots remove nitrates. What I get approached about the most, though, is wetlands, because typically there's wet areas or floodplain areas that farmers are, farming, and so they and when they can no longer produce much there, they might come forward and say, what else can be done with this land? What can be done? Do you have a project or a program? Sometimes we do, and sometimes, as Faith mentioned, the topography of the area or the soil types don't help us much.
Yeah.
But,
I just want to mention, Gretchen did put a link to that Minnesota certification program in the chat if people want to
Yeah.
learn more about that. Thank you,
very
Gretchen. Wonderful.
interesting.
Yeah, that's kind of unique. Do you know of any other states in the upper Midwest that are doing that? I know Iowa doesn't.
The certification process that's going on in Iowa, that there's some energy behind, and I'd like to research it a little bit more. I claim a certain degree of ignorance about it right now, but is the STAR certification.
Yes.
As I understand it, that is actually kind of an endorsement of production methods with the idea of potentially marketing those sustainably raised products to, to buyers, like to Cargill or ADM or something like that. There's certain counties where that's being piloted right now, but it's not statewide. And I don't know, I don't know where that's going to go yet. I've actually been looking into that just this week. This is something that I would like to investigate further. I think it holds some promise.
Other questions across the board? Let's bring Heidi back in here too. Heidi, having heard, you gave us the giant picture. And then Clark and Faith brought us down to closer to home. But what kind of thoughts do you have after all of this discussion? That, just sort of bringing it all back together. And you're going to have to unmute yourself.
Well, I guess I'll go. I guess anyone wants to talk. I think having Faith and Clark share, what is working in their watershed is huge. And like Clark said, what works in one watershed doesn't always work in another watershed. We see that in fishers and farmers. We can't push, our priorities in another watershed. It takes the whole community working together to work on this. And that's what I love about having, these webinars, because we can share information and learn from each other and reach out in ways that we haven't been able to do. And that, one great thing about the pandemic we've seen is some of our farmer-led groups have actually gone virtual. They're having virtual field days, and I'm seeing farmers do PowerPoint presentations, and they've never, hardly touched a computer before. And so it's pushing us in ways that we haven't been pushed before. And I think it's really, really cool. In reaching out, like Faith was talking about, reaching out with different farmers, different producers, and having Faith on the ground, boots on the ground, that is key. I hear that in every watershed. That's one common thing, is having the boots on the ground. We don't have conservationists working, walking every farm like we used to have. You used to hear about conservationists going out there and walking almost every farm. We don't have people doing that anymore, and that's what we need to get back to. We're seeing, in the Root River watershed, we're seeing the Minnesota Department of Ag do that working with Ron Miners, and they had, was it 99% of the farmers said, yep, come on my farm, walk the land with me, bring your map, and that's the one question I had for Faith, is if you're using the agricultural conservation planning framework tool, put out there by Mark Homer. And you know, and that's key. And I'm starting to hear maybe NRCS is using that more often now. You know, maybe opening some doors, you know, that
Yeah,
weren't open before with some of these tools.
Yeah, it's really great and it's really useful, especially when you're in the office and you want to figure out what would be a great spot for a saturated buffer. You can just go onto that tool and you can see some spots, and then you can call the producer and just be like, hey, I saw this using this tool. Like, can we come out and have a walk and just look at it? And that's been pretty great too. Yeah, so it's very useful.
Some comments that I'll just kind of share. The other side, I mean, you all are in the work of presenting a rosy picture because you want people to do all of this, and you want to say, we're here to help. I'm the government, we're here to help, right? But I want to at least acknowledge some jaundice among non-farming type people, that are we not paying people to clean up the old mess that they made? And I'm saying that very crudely, of course, but some of us can look at it that way. So you went out and you plowed fence row to fence row. And some of us are old enough to remember Earl Butts, get big or get out. But now we're paying the price of those kind of federal policies. So any thoughts that you have, because now we have a new administration, and actually a head of the Department of Agriculture that most of us know in Tom Vilsack. Can you share any kinds of bits of optimism given that transition, that we might be able to see some of these practices speeded up, so to speak? I mean, but I also want to recognize another, from my perspective, you talk about boots on the ground. You want to get out there. I can tell you that my NRCS team and my IDOLS team can barely handle what walks in the door. We just don't have the staff. I mean, they look at me like, well, we got to do some messaging and some outreach. And they're like, I don't need any more people coming in the door, because we can hardly handle the people that are coming in right now, especially during a time when Conservation Reserve Program is up for renewal and those things. But those are just some of the background underlying issues that make your work even more challenging. So maybe give us a little crystal ball picture, what you might hope for with this new administration.
Yeah, that is very true. I would speak just from what I've been seeing, especially in our NRCS office with our IDOL staff and all of that. We do a good job with managing everything that walks through the door, but there are a lot of long days. There is a lot of just running all over the place trying to get things done. So especially speaking from what I see in the watershed, most watershed project coordinators projects are about 20,000 acres in size, and I have 10 of those. So, I mean, it is a lot of work to do. It's a ton. So I would definitely like to see more funding allocated for adequate staffing. I mean, that just kind of needs to happen if we really want to see a huge difference in what we're doing. But yeah, that's pretty much what I've seen. So.
I mentioned in my presentation a little bit about an externality, and kind of getting back to that. That is, I mean, how we deal with other externalities, like say air pollution, or asbestos. For instance, all of these particular issues are the result of a production method or an industrial activity of some kind, and yet the cost is being absorbed by everyone. And so, yeah, that is the case with nutrient pollution as well. Now, how we address that, I don't know. I mean, what you're really talking about is the elephant in the room, regulation, and whether or not regulation should be instituted. And you can find some pretty valid opinions on both sides about that particular issue, because with regulation, there also would have to be monitoring, and there would have to be enforcement. And you're dealing with large swaths of land, and you're dealing with private entrepreneurs, and I mean and then there's also the issue of, no matter what, somebody's got to go out and work with a person, and get something developed. And from my own particular experience as a teacher, you don't get very far by shaming somebody into something.
Right.
They'll dig in their heels. And so for me personally, as I work, I try to appeal to people's best nature and their desire to do more. I think, we can say that it's a legal issue, but it's also very much an ethical issue.
Mhm.
And whether or not we can legislate ethics to the point that will satisfactorily answer those ethical problems is a question that all societies have faced for thousands of years. I love Aldo Leopold's words. I read him often, and he talks about the land ethic. In my mind, that's what we need to try to get towards. We need to change the view of what our community is and what we actually share and what we're actually a part of. We're not just citizens of this community. I'm not just an owner of the land. I am, a person on this planet who cares for other people and for the whole biome. And so that land ethic, that isn't there yet, but I think that you can see some growth in it, as opposed to, say, the 19th century view of land.
Mhm.
And so I hope we get to that fast enough. But that's my view of it, is that it's an ethical issue. I think that's where we really need to make the change.
I want to remind this group, I want to remind our speakers that this group is mostly urban. There are a few of us, I think, that are landowners and farmers, but it's an urban group. And so to that end, I want to point out the impact that the Farm Bill has on the Upper Midwest. The Farm Bill is up for renewal once every 5 years. So once that's set in, then you've got 5 years. But prior to renewing it, there's 2 to 3 years that are intense negotiations. And so I see that as another opportunity with the change in administration, is that we can work toward the next Farm Bill in a way that will reinforce more of these conservation practices. And my NRCS director is fond of reminding my commission group that people don't own the land not to have it work for them, that it's there for an economic purpose, and part of that is balancing the common good, as Clark just pointed out, with the economic value that's in there. And I think one of the ways that we're seeing is an effective tool to teach them is to recognize the amount of money they're losing by over applying fertilizer that gets washed down the river, for one thing. So we've seen lots of new technologies now that have seriously reduced the amount of chemical fertilizer they have to put on. And the other part is as they learn the value of how much topsoil they're losing, and that we actually can calculate that now and put a dollar amount on it and show them. So I think there are some, I love the new technology. I was going to ask if any of you are using drones in your work. Yeah, no?
No,
Okay,
I haven't, but I have for like geologic research and stuff like that, but haven't been really able to incorporate that yet.
Mhm.
I have once with surveying an area for potential wetland, and it's kind of a good way to get a view of it. But one of the problems with drone technology, of course, is that you need an FAA license in order to use them, and I don't have time to even get through some of my own professional training, let alone. Now I see they do have a drone seeding of cover crops too, which I think is fascinating.
Right,
And,
that's why I brought that up, yeah.
yeah. And that's very promising, because I think aerial seeding offers a a chance to get those cover crops in much earlier and get some good out of them.
Mhm. Heidi, are you using drones at all?
He just purchased an underwater drone. You know, I'm a fish biologist, so we're looking at freshwater mussel habitat, lake sturgeon habitat. So I wear all different hats. So we tried getting an aerial drone, but then, you know, like everyone else, we needed an FAA license, and so we're working on that. But we do have an underwater one too, so we'll get there. I just wanted to mention too, one of the watersheds, Al Cross
Stop.
from the Cannon River Watershed Partnership, they have done aerial seeding up there in Minnesota. So you could check or reach out to Al. You could probably find him on our website.
Some interesting comments in the chat about sometimes this is like turning the Titanic, right? So I'll just, as we wrap up, I'll share a couple of personal thoughts. I grew up as a 4-H'er in Iowa. In the days in the 40s and 50s when we grew everything we ate. I think my parents only bought flour, sugar, and coffee in town. But I can remember my father saying one day, we're going to get in the car and drive over to next county. I want to check out this new crop I've heard about. And we all go, really, Dad? Because we didn't have a lot of money and you just didn't spend a lot of gas driving to the next county. On a joyride. And so we drove to the next county to look at the first field of soybeans in the early 50s.
Yeah.
So they just weren't a crop 70 years ago. And then I can remember in high school in 4-H going and in Johnson County, Iowa, looking at the first grassed waterway as a conservation practice, and that would have been in the late 50s. So yes, it is like turning the Titanic, but I do think that education at all levels really is the key to making this happen. And thank you, Rose Nassif. Yes, it's education along with federal policy. So that's why I brought up the Farm Bill. So if you have an interest in deeper diving into the policy end of it, that's a real opportunity. I know as soil and water district commissioners, some of us are pretty engaged in that and advocating right now for certain things to be put in there. So it isn't like it's not impossible, but I'm encouraged a lot by even 5 years ago, the discussion around cover crops was pretty minimal. And yet my guess is, I bet we've got them in every county, right, Clark? I would say in every county, there has to be some cover.
Yeah,
crop.
there is statewide in Iowa, it's about 4% of the acreage. In the watershed that I work in, the Miller Creek watershed, it's a 41,000 acre watershed. We're at about 17.5% of the acres. Blackhawk County is at 9,000. So we're one of the higher ones. There are higher. There's some watersheds and counties in Iowa that are a little higher, but statewide, 4% is good. That's better than it was 5 years ago. You're absolutely right. And I'm hoping to see more growth with that, because also the cover crop industry itself represents a third crop to get away from that monoculture. I mean, and selling seed, there could be a lot of local growers and another a level of economic opportunity there that also has environmental benefits. So it has.
I see, okay. I see Mary Posher has her hand up. Mary, you want to unmute yourself? Did you want to speak, Mary?
I did
Okay.
not. I don't know
Oh.
how I put that up.
Okay. Well, we're up to the last few minutes, but the bigger picture too is, yes, working with local FFA and 4-H groups. That's a big part of what we do as soil and water commissioners, is really going after that next generation. The other big picture I wanted to bring in, again, because this is mostly a non-farming group, is perennial crops. I don't want to leave without mentioning those, because there are people who think broader and more globally to the time when the rest of the world will be growing its own corn and soybeans. And actually, we're probably overproducing corn, in my opinion, because that's why we have ethanol. We don't have ethanol because we needed it. We had too much corn and there weren't enough buyers. And what happens? the amount of investment in the infrastructure to grow these monoculture row crops is huge. A combine can cost $250,000. So you just can't stop growing corn, or you just can't stop growing soybeans because there's no market for them. So you find other uses. And I was told my group earlier today, there's a new couple of books out about the chemical changes that have occurred in the last 150 years. It started with World War I, when we started producing chemicals for noxious gases. But each world war produced new technology, new uses. And what happened after the Second World War was they had invested a huge amount of infrastructure into producing aluminum for airplanes. Well, suddenly we had lots of aluminum, and all the infrastructure was there to make aluminum. So somebody said, well, let's put soda pop in a can. So now we have cans, you know. So that's, to me, is what happened to corn. We had too much investment in growing corn to just suddenly stop growing corn. But at the same time, people are recognizing that other countries are going to be able to feed themselves eventually. And we actually don't feed the world. We barely feed ourselves here in the Midwest. Iowa imports 90% of its food.
Yeah.
So some of those things are down the road. And that's why I mentioned the farm policy, in that there's an opportunity there. And again, it is like turning the Titanic, but to make some changes in those things. And I'll leave with just a kind of an amusement when we were talking about water quality. So I live on what is called the world's largest rural water system, the Rathbun Rural Water System, which runs the bottom 2 tiers of county from I-35 to the Mississippi River and the top 2 tiers of Missouri, right? So my water comes well filtered and very drinkable. But they sent out a newsletter and they said, we want you to be partners with us in clean water. And so here are 4 things you can do. And one of them was clean the poop up after your dog in your yard. Now, I have to admit, I just kind of drop my jaw, right? I clean up the poop after my one dog, and yet my neighbor is spreading how many hundreds of thousands of liquid manure from the CAFOs on the fields? So how is my cleaning up one dog going to do anything other than make me feel good, probably? I think sometimes we really have to look at those broader issues. And unfortunately, I'm fond of saying sometimes things have to get worse before they can get better. But I honestly don't know how much worse it can get when Iowa has the dirtiest water in the country. So we certainly have some incentive to do better. I'm going to check. Mary Jo, you want to unmute yourself? Unmute yourself, Mary Jo.
Okay, thank you. I'm not very good at all this stuff, but I'm trying. Yes, I think we can make a difference, and we have to, in the in people's behavior, and that's all people, whether they live in the city or in the suburbs or on the farms. And one of the funniest things I've seen in a while, and humor is always good instead of finger pointing, was a sign at what's the name of it? Anyway, a local creek, and that the city of Coon Rapids has worked very hard to keep improving the banks, et cetera, with our soil and water conservation district. And the sign is there for all to see who use the trail. Pick up after your dog. The poop fairy doesn't work here. And and it's a cute picture of a fairy, little fairy with a little wand. And I think that that's sort of an effort, if it can be, widely spread, or wherever you can make it visible to people, that really gets you on board without pointing fingers, and changes habits. We're all in this together. So if you do it, if you or I do a better job with our dog, that's two.
Good point. Yeah, good point. Yeah.
Right.
Well, I want to wrap this up by saying, first of all, be sure and check out the chat. There is a couple of meetings coming up. One is tonight. Chris Jones is going to be speaking at 7 o'clock via Zoom, and you can attend that. I really encourage people to check him out. He's one of my favorite gurus on this subject.
I want
And
to thank you. I want to really thank you. We've learned a lot.
Thank you. And also a link to UMR. So we record these programs. We had some really good conversation with David Dernberger last fall, talking about the nutrient reduction program in Iowa and why, in his opinion, it ain't ever going to work because it would take way too long as a voluntary program. But he does have some really good slides, really digging deep into the issue of point source pollution and non-point source pollution. So if you're interested in that, that's available on our website as well. And you can sign up for our newsletters. Gretchen, our communications person, does a blog that is just full of interesting things. And a final pitch again for, this is a program sponsored by the Upper Mississippi River Region, an interleague organization of the League of Women Voters that includes Minnesota, Iowa, Wisconsin, and Illinois. We have a board, and our board is looking for a vice chair starting July 1st. I am moving up as vice chair into the chair position. And I can tell you, I jumped into the vice chair as a new member and knew nothing, but it's a very fun group, a very generous group, and we can get you up to speed real fast. So if you have a passion for our work and are willing to volunteer and help us out, again, you can contact us through that website. Let us know if you have an interest, and Gretchen will put you in touch with our nominating committee. I have to say, we're not real picky. No one stood up and waved their hands and said, yeah, pick me, pick me. But it is a great way to learn more about the work in these 4 states and some awesome people doing some really incredible work. So thank you, Heidi, Clark, and Faith. What a splendid program. And again, it is recorded if you want to go back and read it all again, or if you want to go back and share it with your friends. One of the things that I have suggested to small local leagues is you don't have to have a big full program of speakers. A lot of these programs, because of the pandemic, are now being recorded. And I know Gretchen told us the other day that the David Dernberger thing has been viewed over how many people? How many times?
150 some.
Yes.
David
So,
Osterberg.
Osterberg. And so that is another way for the local leagues to really gain access to high quality program. So again, thank you all for coming today and being part of this. And please spread the word. Spread the word with your friends.
Okay, Heidi, thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.